reporter asked Trump about Venezuela, he said Venezuela is not very far away, and the people are suffering and they're dying. We have many options for Venezuela, including a possible military operation if necessary. Asked if it would be a U.S.-led military operation, Trump said, quote, "We don't talk about it, but a military operation, a military option, is certainly something that we would pursue." And HR writes in parentheses, there were no military options under consideration. So, HR, that was August of 2017. Here we are in January 2025. There was a military option that was pursued. Two questions for you, my friend. Number one, what happened in the early 8 years that led us to the military invasion? Secondly, I assume you approve of the choice of going in and taking out Maduro and his wife and returning to the U.S. for trial. But my question is, does this pass the master standard, which is don't start something unless you have an exit strategy?
Well, there's a lot of consistency with President Trump between Trump 1 and Trump 2 because he used to say, hey, General, we're all the way over there fighting in Afghanistan. And Venezuela is right there. So he would be in conversations with leaders in the region who were highlighting, the devastating effect that Maduro had on the Venezuelan population, about roughly 1 million refugees. But he was talking to people like Santos in Colombia, for example, and talking to Mexican leaders, prior to Lopez Obrador coming in to Mexico, the PRI leaders in Mexico. And so he heard it from a lot of different leaders. But I think what's happened is, really with the Biden administration's decision not to secure the southern border and the continued mass exodus of Venezuelans, many of whom were coming into the country illegally, and Maduro was taking advantage of that to export much of his organized crime into the United States. This really ignited Trump's desire to do something about this problem. Now, what do you see with President Trump in this decision to launch this extremely complicated and highly successful raid to arrest Maduro and his wife? What you also see with him is he wants to make a deal first, right? So he thought that he could make a deal maybe with Maduro. He sent, remember, Grinelda as his special envoy initially to negotiate the release of some unlawfully detained Americans, and then also to get to have a conversation about some kind of an accommodation with Maduro. But Maduro turned out to be intransigent, like the Iranians were intransigent when he tried to get a deal with them, and then joined in a very successful IDF campaign with the strikes on the deep buried nuclear facilities. So I see a lot of consistency, Bill, rather than
he doesn't want to clean into his house.
But the exit strategy, I'll let you run the way in here. Is this the regime thing? Are we putting in a new regime, or are we going to see the rule too old? Can you take that?
Well, I think first of all, let's give some historical perspective going back even before 2017, because it's clear that when the national security strategy came out, it said something very important that many commentators missed, and that was its enunciation of the Trump corollary. By putting the Western Hemisphere first in the ordering of priorities, the national security strategy broke new ground. But to me, the most remarkable thing was the expression of Trump corollary, because the Roosevelt corollary, dating back to 1904, was Theodore Roosevelt's assertion that the corollary of the Monroe Doctrine, that non-American powers could not become involved in the politics of the Americas, was that if a government in the Caribbean or Latin America was badly run, the United States reserved the right to intervene to sort it out. So when the President was in November, to me that was a big takeaway. And it turned out not to take many weeks for the Trump corollary to put into action. And I do think that's a really important starting point for this conversation, because what do we know about the history of the Roosevelt corollary? The history of the Roosevelt corollary was that the United States repeatedly intervened in Haiti, in Nicaragua, in Panama, creating the state of Panama in effect, and in Cuba. And each of these interventions had all kinds of complications. It's very difficult to come in and get rid of the president you don't like and then create the president that you do like and expect it all to run smoothly. So
I don't got
I
time.
think there's 2 points really. One, you can't detract from the boldness and the immaculate execution. Hats off to the CIA, to Delta Force, and I think to the German Joint Chiefs, General Kane. This has been an exemplary show of force, and it's hard to believe that any of America's competitors amongst the authoritarian states could do anything remotely as impressive as this. But as Colin Powell used to say, you break it, you do own it. It's not at all clear what comes next. And to answer your question directly, Bill, the administration does not seem to want to bring in the opposition, the legitimate, democratically elected politicians who could govern, or at least who aspire to govern Venezuela. They want to deal with the remnants of the Chavista regime that Maduro inherited from Hugo Chavez. And that is, I think, going to be a very tricky thing to pull off, given the fact that that regime is shot through not only with corruption and criminality, but also with support from Cuba, from China, from Russia, from the bad guys. It's hard to believe that there really is a stable deal to be done with the remnants of the Maduro regime, in my view.
Let me offer a gloomier forecast, and this is a trial balloon to be shot down by my fellow good fellows. First of all, yes, I'm amazed at the competence and execution of our armed forces. HR, your buddies really know what they're doing. 32-0 against the Cuban defenders of Maduro was spectacular. I think they have in mind that, the left, they don't want another Iraq, they don't want another Afghanistan, they wouldn't mind another Libya.
Got it.
This was not a coup. We didn't orchestrate a coup. It was not an invasion. There's no Americans on the ground. We didn't force a different order. We simply removed one leader and left intact whoever's there. So I'm channeling movement here, which seems like and basically the left, we don't care what happens in your country. You can keep left-wing kleptocracy. You're right to hear him doing that. To take out Cuba, Russia, Iran, China.
I said I can hear him doing that.
Other than that, we don't care. Go at it. Now, we're in a moment of great volatility, and what I foresee here is, let's look at the players. There's the old regime, which they now need to consolidate very quickly because they understand if they lose power, it's not going to be a pleasant little retirement in Dubai or a Truth and Reconciliation Commission.
Oh my gosh!
So they're going to cover it. There's about a third of the country run by whatever we call narco-terrorist gangs, and they understand they need to control territory and get along with their government. They're going to cover it. There's ordinary people who pick number one and number two, but rising is very difficult. There's the opposition group, who has, of course, all the moral authority and the backing of the aircraft carriers that Belgium can provide. I'm being sarcastic there. But they do also have the backing of the diaspora, who also hates the current regime, so they can put up quite a bit of a fight. So that looks like a recipe for civil war and chaos. And I don't see any likelihood of the U.S. putting boots on the ground and actually doing something, especially once the window of opportunity for a swift, here's who's in charge, get used to it, has passed. And that opportunity will pass very quickly. So that's the gloomy forecast. The one optimistic forecast I've heard is that the Venezuelans have a memory of democracy, prosperity, functioning economy. So it's not like going into Afghanistan, which is essentially a medieval country, and saying, here, hold elections and that's not and especially the diaspora and civil society still exists. So I do have hope that can emerge, but it doesn't look like it's going to result or have much U.S. intervention so long as it is.
Hey, Bill, about your question, I agree with John and Neil. This really, you see President Trump trying to pursue an alternative to really what would be necessary to effect a change in the nature of the government, such that the Constitution is restored. And the Venezuelan people regain their sovereignty. They expressed their will in the last election. Over 70% of them voted to allow. But of course, you have tools of coercion still. The armed forces, and then these sort of brigades of ground shirts. And as Nilo alluded to, this is essentially a criminalized patronage network that he sits at the top of. It is a narco-terrorist network, but it's also a criminalized network that has created dependencies among a lot of Venezuelans on that socialist government remaining in power. That has to be broken for there to be real reform. What President Trump is doing is what is often termed the coercive diplomacy or forceful persuasion, because he doesn't want to do what he regards as like regime change, nation building. These are dirty words in his mind because he's viewing Venezuela largely through the lens of the difficulties that we encountered in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think, and a misdiagnosis of what the lesson for those words from my view. But to be successful in coercive diplomacy, you have to have clear objectives. Okay, what are the objectives? We're talking about behavior of the regime rather than the nature of the regime. It's narcotics trafficking. It's giving a platform for our adversaries in the region. It's the subsidization of far-left political movements and what I would call like progressive authoritarian dictatorships in the region, including Cuba and Nicaragua, for example. There are a whole list of behaviors that we want to change. So what are we demanding? And then the second is, how do we create a sense of urgency among the elites there to meet our demands? What kind of punishment are we willing to issue? Remember you said, Vice President, it's going to be worse for you than it is for Maduro. But are there other inducements being offered? But like John, and I think I don't see any fundamental change in the behavior of this government until the nature of the government changes. And the one thing that we didn't mention is there is also kind of an ideological dimension to this as well that runs through the Chavistas. And so, I don't think they're going to fire themselves. I think it's going to take a lot more to get the outcome of Venezuela I think we would want to see, which is sovereignty restored to the Venezuelan people.
But we seem to tolerate narco-terrorist states all over the world, like everything from southern Mexico through Colombia, parts of it. We tolerate horrendous undemocratic regimes in Yemen, Somalia, with suffering without interfering, so long as they're not bothering us on other missions. So I am completely with you on what I wish would be the case. I wish the democratic opposition takes over quickly, but I don't see the U.S. forcefully doing it. Really nothing to negotiate.
Well, I think what you're going to see is continued pressure on cash flow associated with the narcotics trafficking. That's why they're destroying the boats, and then also I think we're going to see the seizure of more of these oil tankers. I think with Venezuela, it's clear that the cartel that Maduro's the head of is interconnected with the cartels in Mexico. Is a big part of their cash flow and their strength and their ability to release the jobs, as you mentioned. I mean, they control 30% of the territory in Mexico. They control more than the narcotics trafficking. They control about I think also 30% of retail fuel sales in Mexico as well. They're gaining more and more power. And I think President Trump, that's next on his list. He mentioned Petro in Colombia as well. And I think the way President Trump looks at this is that they're poisoning Americans, right? It really is like his engagement against these cartels is, from his perspective, an America First approach. And he sees the poison of Americans as essentially acts of war. So I think you're going to see a lot more pressure on the Mexicans. What the Mexicans should do, and they actually are doing, is allowing a higher degree of cooperation with U.S. law enforcement and I think increasingly it'll be military forces and advisors as well. The question is, does the Mexican government have the political will to take on the cartels? I think that's the big question.
Gentlemen, why does the president keep talking about oil? I know that energy is a big part of the strategy and the mega vision, but when asked about Venezuela, rather than talking about human rights, rather than talking about drug trafficking, he keeps going back to oil.
We're going to have our very large United States oil companies, the biggest anywhere in the world, go in, spend billions of dollars, fix the badly broken infrastructure, the oil infrastructure, and start making money for the country.
Hey, he loves to talk about oil. Even during Civil War, there's a lot of continuity here as well. But I would also say that when you look at what it was a precedent for this, and maybe Neil will have some, and John will have some thoughts on this as well, which is the Panama invasion in 1989. You had the same confluence of issues. You had really a narcotics trafficking head of state who was indicted by the United States, a criminal head of state. But also you had a country with significant strategic value. In this case, it wasn't oil, it was the Panama Canal. But in Venezuela, Venezuela sits on top of the largest oil reserves in the world. And so Trump looks at that and he says, do I really want Venezuela to be aligned with China, with Russia, to be underwriting the Cuban Army's dictatorship in Cuba with shipments of free or low-cost oil to Cuba, for example? You just put pressure on Mexico for the same thing. So I see kind of some continuities there, and it's really the strategic value of the country is what he sees, and oil is the main reason for that.
Two things. One is that, as Akar says, this is how Trump rolls. There's always supposed to be a business angle, whether we're dealing with the Middle East or Europe or Russia. This is one of the leitmotifs of Trump's style. That's why I came up with the term real estate politique as opposed to realpolitik. Because for Donald Trump, realism is there's a deal to be done. But there's a strategic dimension too, since Venezuela's oil resources were being accessed by China rather than serving any benefit to the United States. You can understand the desire to put an end to that. And I do think we have to understand this Venezuela not just in the context of the Western Hemisphere, but in its global context, as striking a blow at a weak spot within the axis of authoritarians, in the same way that hitting Iran last year struck at a weak spot. And from the vantage point of Xi Jinping, this is galling. From the vantage point of Vladimir Putin too, Venezuela has been an asset for those guys. The question is, does this then legitimize their claims on territories in their vicinity, notably Ukraine, in the case of Russia, Taiwan in the case of China? Just before this operation happened, just days before, the Chinese organized a huge naval and air display of force.
Really live fire exercise, Neil. Really. Yeah.
It was on the largest that we have seen in recent years in terms of its scale. So I think the other interesting question that we should talk about is, where does this lead? Not just in Venezuela, because it's clear that the situation in Venezuela is very fluid and unstable, but there are all sorts of ramifications in the rest of the world. And not content with this extraordinary move in Caracas, President Trump then turns his attention to Greenland and sets the hair of the Europeans ablaze. Now, I think my own view is that this is something of a diversionary tactic, and that we've seen this before. President Trump likes to raise flammable issues when he's doing something decisive. I'd personally be very surprised if the United States does anything remotely dramatic with respect to Greenland beyond some possible diplomatic overtures. But I think this is a big global game that's being played here. And President Trump is good at this game, but his adversaries are also capable of playing it too. And I wonder, HR, if you expect there to be consequences that can't necessarily be controlled by the United States in the coming weeks and months.
Hey, well, Neil, just first your point about the degree to which this could be viewed as some kind of an equivalence with what, with what China would want to do with Taiwan or with what Russia's done to Ukraine. I think this is where we have to get much better at our diplomatic messaging, our public diplomacy. Say, hey, look, this guy was an indicted criminal who stole the election from the Venezuelans. We'll extinguish freedom there, and this is a unique circumstance. I wish we'd be better at that. But the more we just talk about like the oil and these other issues, it really does really cede some of the high ground, at least for some people around the world. And then I do think that what's really happening here is something that's quite the opposite of what the national security strategy was. Remember, everybody was like, "Hey," he didn't talk about great power competition in the national security strategy. But what drew him in, I think, in part to Venezuela is, as you pointed out, the fact that it has been a platform for Russia and China. What draws him to Greenland is the competition in the Arctic with who? Well, with Russia and China. And so Trump is a lot less isolationist than maybe some of the people in his administration. And if you follow what he does, right, instead of maybe what was just in that strategy, or what he says from time to time, I think that's the right way to do it. I agree with you. I don't think he's going to do anything with Greenland, but I hope what this does is open the door for more cooperation with Denmark and with NATO to maybe strengthen our military presence there, and go back to where it was maybe 20 years ago.
I want to add a couple of comments on oil. Of course, I don't think Vladimir Putin cares one bit of Xi Jinping about legitimacy and to define their points of international law, as evidenced by their reaction. So I wouldn't worry about that too much. The oil is interesting, but I don't think we're going after for oil. The report that how they sold it to Trump. Venezuela's oil will take a long time to come out. There's a lot of investment. Kind of funny that with these reasons, they would be subsidizing foreign imports, which are low cost and undercut the U.S. producers' permanent base, not exactly the usual thing. But there's a sadness to this. The era of free trade meant that you didn't have to own countries, you could buy stuff when you needed. And going to the era where trade is used as a field for keeping competition forces countries to be willing to own things. Drugs.
It was what I killed it. I had to do this way. No, it was. It didn't come up in the middle. It was always
starting a war like that in women seems sort of low. This is,
oh my God,
very popular opinion. More on drugs and women. Imagine drugs were legal. Are very high. And the alternative is the borders don't feel about a war. My last comment, Greenland. We ought to also go back to the old-fashioned practice, Alaska, buying things, rather than talking about wars. There's 50,000 people in Greenland, $50 billion cheap price. Greenland, that's $1 million each. Staple it to a blue card and a condo in Miami. I think we got Greenland in about 20 minutes. There's a deal to be had with.
I think he's got something like that in mind, honestly. I really do.
I don't know, feel for a real estate developer in Trump. Why bother threatening the U.S. news? But it's going to cost of sending one aircraft carrier up there.
I got it. I put all your buttons. I'll put it.
The only of the Russian mindset these days, I don't know if you saw the tweet put out by the Russian foreign minister who blasted the United States for invading a sovereign nation, which I assume he's just irony impaired. But then there was a article today, Neil, which suggested that Russia offered the United States a deal charged to end the Cuban Missile Crisis, or charged for the Soviet Union took out the missiles from Cuba, and took out the missiles from Jupiter from Turkey. And the Russian proposal was that if we took our hands off Ukraine, we would take our hands off Venezuela.
Well, I read the same report. This was heard at some point. I'm not sure how far that I must bear in mind that a lot of the commentary that we hear around these issues is pretty unreliable because in truth, what has gone on in the last few weeks, as HR will confirm, is unknown to journalists. It cannot be known to journalists because it's in the realm of highly classified information. It'll be many years really before historians can say what happened. I'll give you a good example. Why did Trump decide not to back the opposition? Because he felt that he should won themselves right. That is almost certain. But it's the kind of thing that,
That's how Marine got running that George Bush went into. His younger George Bush went into Iraq because he wanted to prevent the bomb.
exactly.
Let me turn on that one. Obviously, Russia made that happen. But it's got nothing to give. The idea that Russia has also their military money and other stuff to send to...
What do you want?
Well, in fact, this is a great moment for the actors of evil is to run out of money. Where they have to give to Venezuela, nothing. What do the Cubans have to give to Venezuela? This is going to cut off a lot of oil to Cuba, which is... So, with the exception of China, which is easy for them to say, well, we'll offer something to you and we'll stop supporting Venezuela if you're
This is gonna hurt.
free offer.
Yeah, it's important. He'll mention this too, but the axis of authoritarians and aggressors. But what really, I think we're seeing them in a
52
profoundly
damage.
weak position.
Wow.
And this is where I hope that President Trump kind of sees the reaction that happened in China. They went to their highest level of cyber alert in China. They shut down any kind of message that had to do with Venezuela. And it's just a reminder that Xi Jinping likes to appear strong, but who does he fear more than anything else? His own people. How about the protests in Iran? They're not the same scale as they were after Masa Amini's murder, but they're widespread and they're continuing. And then, Bill, you pointed out to us that they're going to pay Iranians a stipend of $7 a month, to try to placate. I mean, so I think that is Iran really is in a position of profound weakness at this moment. Their currency has collapsed. Tehran is running out of water, and so I hope that President Trump will also realize that Putin is in a position of profound weakness. Part of Putin's ruse with President Trump is that he's got something to offer us, a great deal. If we can work together on some big issues, economically, we can work well together. And he tries to portray strength. Like an overwhelming Russian victory in Ukraine is inevitable. So I hope that really the weakness of really Maduro, security around him, expose that ripple effect in these other authoritarian regimes also helps President Trump and others come to the realization that Putin is in a position of profound weakness. And in fact, this competition with the Axis of aggressors, and what Nilo is calling this Cold War II, maybe we won already, and we just don't even realize we've won.
Well, I'd love to believe that we're winning Cold War II. I think it's a bit too early to draw that conclusion because the big showdown over Taiwan is yet to happen. And I think that's going to be the real test of who has the upper hand, not what happens in Venezuela or even in Iran.
All right, we have 2 minutes left here, so one final topic here for you. What next in terms of what country should be worried? Put your money on Colombia or your money on Cuba?
Cuba. I think Cuba is really worth watching at this point. Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor, simultaneously has done that since Henry Kissinger. Right. And he's in a very, very strong position at this point. This whole operation has his fingerprints on it. He was the one who was out there doing the shows at the weekend, explaining the rationale, moderating some of what President Trump said in his presser. And I thought it was highly interesting what Rubio said about Cuba. So I think Cuba is the very obvious next shoe to drop, and that regime should be very worried.
Isn't the most likely pressure from Mexico and Colombia, Cuba for internal collapse? are we going to really start up again in the 1960s?
150.
That's a good question. HR, are we starting again poisoning Castro?
Or Zach.
I
Or
think
just
they
let it collapse.
poisoned themselves, right? That economy is in collapse also based on, the corruption of this dictatorship. And you know what? Venezuela was their lifeline. I mean, this is what's really important. We talked about kind of the upstream support for Venezuela, coming from China, coming from Russia, also coming from Cuba with some security assistance and so forth. How'd that work out? That really well for them. And from Iran. But how about all the downstream support that Venezuela provides? In the region.
What's that?
I mean, really, a huge source of support for the Cuban army.
Yes.
In Cuba.
No,
That's cool.
no.
How about Daniel Ortega? Daniel Ortega's in a really difficult position in Nicaragua. And then, as you alluded to, I mean, Mexico's under pressure. You heard the president's statements about Petro and Colombia. Hey, there's an election there this year. I think what you're seeing, you're going to see it as kind of a broader movement in the hemisphere as well, of a swinging of the pendulum back from the far left. There was a pink wave in the hemisphere in the last 8 years or so. And it's going to swing back because of the failure of these far-left progressive governors. Already failed in Peru. Already failed in Chile. Petro is deeply unpopular in Colombia. As we've been talking about, Cuba and Nicaragua are in real positions of weakness. So I think that this could be a moment of opportunity. You had the Trump support for Milei in Argentina. Argentina finally may be able to stick with reform long enough to finally turn the corner. And they're doing it with U.S. support, which could be a bottle like Chile was decades ago. So I feel pretty good about the hemisphere now. I mean, there's going to be more pressure on these governments. But there's also an opportunity at this moment to work with the U.S. on some of these fundamental problems, economic problems, and the security issues associated mainly with narco-terrorist organizations that the administration is labeling.
So Neil, a historical question: when the Japanese government transitioned in 1945, what American oversaw the effort?
Well, that was, of course, General MacArthur's responsibility.
So, as we look at Venezuela, perhaps we should be considering a current or former general to help with things. Can we think of anybody who might want to spend some time in Caracas?
But before we send HR to Venezuela, remember that the Roosevelt corollary meant not that we directly run those places. It meant that we determine who runs those places. So the Trump corollary is about finding a Venezuelan who can competently run Venezuela. And that I think that's an important distinction here. When Trump says we run it, he doesn't mean an American general is going to run Venezuela. He means we're temporarily in charge until we find somebody to run it better than Maduro is running it. And I think that's a really important point. One last thought to add to that, because I don't think analogies with Japan 1945 are I was kidding. But it's worth saying this is a very, very different thing that's being attempted here. Now, the Roosevelt corollary produced, as I mentioned earlier, multiple American interventions. And the results were mixed. Nobody could say Haiti turned out brilliantly. And in the case of Cuba, it all ultimately ended in the disaster of the Castro Revolution. I wonder if the Trump corollary is going to go better. And I think maybe, for the reason HR just gave, maybe it could go better, because I think Latin America is much more in the mood to go in the direction of democracy, markets, rule of law, what we're seeing in Argentina, than was true back in 1904. So it might just be, dare one suggested, that this is part of a major shift in the region as a whole.
I'm so hard in here. I'm getting mama's getting sweaty.
The last time we brought the word corollary into diplomatic language.
Can you open the window,
One
please?
last addition to the foreign support sources of support have now dried up. The access to anything except for China might have some money, but it's not, and the whole point was we're not gonna take the money.
See what goes well.
And their legitimacy has dried up. Look at the plot that Scott's gonna put up
Okay.
of GDP in Venezuela. And Milton Friedman.
red.
Instead of playing this, we would put
What's that?
instead of playing this, doing it live, we play the YouTube video so you can play it on YouTube.
1950s,
What?
Instead of playing this, why don't we put a YouTube video in the background so you can watch a YouTube video for them?
I think pretty clearly false everywhere, but